Hi guys, it's been a while since I've had a guest on my show because I've been busy going on all sorts of other people's shows because of the release of my recently released book. But I'm glad that I finally am back to hosting people on my show today. I have Noor Bin Ladin with us. How are you doing, Noor?
I'm well, thank you very much.
It's so nice to meet you in person. We've communicated by Twitter. For people who may not know who you are, because you are connected to someone very famous in history, can you tell us who you are and your family links?
Yes, of course. It's a question that, as you can imagine, I'm used to getting often. But yes, my last name is Bin Laden, first name Noor. My mother is Carmen Bin Laden. She is Swiss. And my father is Yeslam Bin Laden. He is Saudi, and he is or was one of Osama bin Laden's brothers. But that's, the facts. I was born and raised in Switzerland and grew up with my mother. My parents split up. I was 8 months old. And so I've actually never been to Saudi Arabia. I was raised solely by my mother, who fought very, very hard to obtain custody of me and my two older sisters and raise us in Switzerland. So this is a very, very long and complex story which spans the entirety of my life, because the battle that my mom fought and the ramifications of this very arduous separation lasted basically 30 years or so.
Are
So
you, did you stay in touch with your dad? Did you have a relationship with him?
it's been very, very complicated. The first years of my life, yes, as a child, but the divorce was just extremely acrimonious, and my father completely rejected me and my sisters for being raised as Westerners by our mother. And sadly, there was no possibility to repair that relationship, in the sense that the gulf was too wide in terms of how my mother decided to raise us here in the West, as opposed to his culture and his values. And it's a very complicated situation. My life has been far from linear, let's put it
Right.
that way.
But
But we will probably get into it throughout the conversation. A cold introduction of myself, and with so many, complicated aspects is
sure.
never the easiest. So I'm sure we'll
Well,
touch
we have
upon
time. Don't
certain
worry about it.
things. We have
Uh,
time.
did you grow up with any Islamic upbringing, or was it a secular upbringing? Did your mother, reject the faith? So how did you, in terms of your relationship with Islam, how did you grow up?
I grew up actually without a religion, but with very strong Judeo-Christian values that my mother imparted on us. Also being brought up in Switzerland and Europe and traveling extensively to the US, this is definitely my culture. But no, I've actually not been exposed in a direct way to Islam. I've actually never set foot in a mosque. And well, in Islam, from my understanding, it's the father's responsibility to, can you say inculcate?
Yeah, I mean,
Impart or impart,
in part,
um, impart, the religious teaching and all of that. And since I didn't grow up with my father, as per my mom's, wishes, because she realized, that this was not what she wanted for us. She really wanted us to grow up with Judeo-Christian values after, having spent time in Saudi Arabia. And that's her whole story of how she came to realize that although she had fallen in love, madly when she was very young with my father, who apparently at the time was very charismatic and charming. And so she made that decision. She followed him and they lived in Saudi Arabia, but slowly but surely she analyzed that society and realized she didn't want to impose this on her girls, and hence the whole battle ensued to free us from that very restrictive, narrow culture that limits people, but especially women in general, to any form of autonomy and freedom.
So what?
And that's why I can be sitting here today, having the pleasure of speaking with you and sharing my thoughts and opinions. And this is something that I value, and I think you do too, from what I've started reading, especially in your last book. You value greatly as well. So
Right. Did you ever meet your famous uncle?
no, that's also a question I get asked quite often, but no, I never met him because, as I said, I've never been to Saudi Arabia.
Right.
But my mother has had a handful of brief encounters with him in Saudi Arabia, which she details in her book. But it was, as you can imagine, very brief because Osama bin Laden was always very pious, and he couldn't interact with women except for immediate family or spouses, plural,
Wow.
obviously.
Wow. So what? So people, I don't think many people knew of you as a public person until, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, until this past September, where you sort of came out to the public conscience and took a position regarding what happened to 9/11, your relationship to 9/11, to the U.S., to Trump. So give us a sense of what that coming out was and why you decided to do it now, not last year or next year.
Um, yes, I am a very private person, and I have been, relatively anonymous since 9/11. That being said, my mother did write a New York Times bestseller book, as I mentioned, and in the aftermath of the tragedy of 9/11, she spoke out she was very vocal about our, when I say our, I mean her, my two sisters, and my condemnation of the barbaric attacks of 9/11. So I have been, as an extension, of my mom becoming public as a means, to let the world know where the four of us, despite the fact that we carry that name, where we stand, as opposed to the rest of the family, but also to warn, the West about what sadly has come to pass the last 20 years. And as we've seen very sadly again yesterday with the latest attacks in France, she discussed this in her book and really wanted to warn the West, that yes, Osama bin Laden is the figurehead and the leader of that movement, jihadist movement. But sadly, there are many others, and I'd love to read. Well, actually, I'll read it to you now. But this is an excerpt of what she wrote, and I think it's very telling of where we are today. This is 20 years ago. Think of this. There are 1.2 billion Muslims in the world. Not all of them, by any means, are fanatics, and I do not mean to suggest that they are. But even assuming only 10% of Muslims follow the strongest, most conservative precepts of Islam, that is 120 million people. Of that number, surely no more than 10% are extremists, but that means 12 million people have been ideologically conditioned to impose their conservative conception of Islam on others. And perhaps 10% of those extremists are so fanatical that they are prepared to die for their beliefs, because dying for them will earn them eternal paradise. This means that scattered all over the world, a shadow army, more than 1 million people strong, is primed to attack Western values and Western culture. And just to add, we are thus at an impasse, our world and theirs. They cannot change, and we must not. We should not allow them to use our tolerance to impose their intolerance on us. Today, fundamentalists have the power to affect us in places they were previously unable to reach. They can strike us whenever they please, and I fear that this will continue now and for as long as the powerful families of the oil kingdoms continue to feel it isn't either their moral duty or it is just politically useful for them to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to spread their beliefs. This is 20 years ago.
I don't think the West has internalized those warnings too well, right? Because if you look at immigration policy, it's been anything but what your mother warned about, what I've warned about, what many people warned about. One of the things that I do in the Parasitic Mind, there are actually several places where I talk about Islam in a very formal way. One of which is in chapter 6, where I talk about a malady that I call ostrich parasitic syndrome, where you constantly seek psychological ways to deny reality. So if a jihadist tells you he's committing this terror attack for these 7 reasons from his religion, then all of the progressive, nuanced Western thinkers will try to protect Islam and say, no, it's because of lack of art exposure, it's because of lone wolfism, it's a man-made disaster, it's mental illness, it's the Zionist occupation, it's beard bullying.
Or they say or the fact that they're uneducated.
Or they're uneducated or they're alienated, which, by the way, it's not true that most of the masterminds are actually very educated and very rich. Look at Osama Bin Laden, look at Ayman al-Zawahiri, the head of, right?
Yes, but there is one story, I'm at the very beginning of your book, but there is one story that you mention in the first chapter when you were in the classroom in Lebanon and the teacher asks, what do you want to be when you grow up? And one of your classmates says, I want to be a
Jew killer.
Can you say it? Yeah, a Jew killer. Yeah. And I was reading this and it's just incredible. My mom has a very similar story about my eldest sister, Wafa, who was in school in Saudi Arabia in the early 80s. And they were teaching my sister at the age of 6 that they had made her write in her notebook, I love Palestine, I hate Jews.
Right.
And this is exactly, this is what they're teaching at such a young age, these young minds. They are conditioning them to hate. And this is in all strata, of society, whether, you're in, Arafat was doing this in Palestine, in school classrooms of like 4 years old,
Well, this is why I get very upset with a lot of, again, the progressive Westerners who try to protect the endemic Jew hatred as, no, it's just Zionism that they hate. It's absolutely not. The Jew hatred that I saw in the most progressive of Middle Eastern countries, which is Lebanon, was everywhere. It is part of it's banal how the Jew hatred and if you, I don't know how far you got in the book, I think you said you're in chapter 1, everything is blamed on the Jew, not the Israeli, the Jew. You got diabetes, it's the Jew. It's raining outside, it's the Jew. Your wife cheated on you, it's the Jew.
But they get this from the Quran.
Yeah, exactly.
Obviously, as I said, I was, shielded by my mother from this ideology. But, considering my very strange life trajectory, I wanted to understand, and to be able to talk about these subjects. And obviously, my mom told me growing up, our household was very, political and history. And I've always been very passionate about all these subjects. And so, you just have to open the Quran and it's there black on white.
Yeah. But of course, one of the things that I do, you'll get to it later in the book, I talk about some of the strategies that people use to delegitimize you if you try to do an honest reading of whether it be the Quran or the Hadith or the Sirah, the biography of Muhammad. And the reason why I am a nightmare for a lot of these imbeciles, and when I'm talking about imbeciles, I'm talking about the Western progressives who try to protect the ideology. It's They can't say I
They
don't know.
cover it up.
Yeah, but
They
but
cover it
but
up.
but they can do it to the guy who's called John Smith and who lives in Arkansas. They can't do it to the guy called Gad Saad who grew up in
What
Lebanon and
about the girl called Noor Bin Ladin? Are they going to try it with me?
right, except as I don't know if I'm allowed to say it, they could get you on the fact that Noor doesn't speak Arabic, but Gad, it's his mother tongue. So you can't tell me that I'm going to look in the Quran, but I can't understand it because if only you understood Arabic, you'd know better. So it's going to take a lot before you try to delegitimize me. It only takes one question to delegitimize a typical Westerner. Do you speak Arabic? No, sit down and shut up, right?
This is one of their arms that they try to
Exactly.
use.
And
Yeah.
so usually with me, the only way that you could delegitimize me is if you then say, but you are not a theologian who studied Islamic jurisprudence
Yes.
at Al Azhar University in Egypt. Ah, so therefore you can't speak about the Quran, right? Because the words kill, 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 kill. If only you understood Arabic philology, it actually means let's have an espresso together.
But then what I do say when I encounter these, arguments, shaky arguments, there is this one author who I really greatly admire. His name is Mark Gabriel, and I don't know if you've heard of him.
I
He
don't think
wrote
so.
this. He's written a few books. One of the best ones is Jesus and Muhammad, and he contrasts the lives of both these men, or in one case, the Son of God and Muhammad, and he goes into detail, and he has the legitimacy to do so because by the age of 6, he knew the Quran off by heart. He was one of these prodigy children whose family had made him, learn everything off by heart, and then he went on to go to Al Azhar, and then at some point he was even a professor at Al Azhar, but then he started questioning Islam, and the result was that his father shot him 5 times for renouncing the
But
faith, but he
peacefully. He shot him
survived.
peacefully, though.
He shot him peacefully.
Okay, so that you
Yeah,
have to say that. Okay, very
yeah,
good.
I know. I mean, it's just ridiculous. But he survived, and thankfully, he he made it, and he's written a few books, including this one, which I encourage your viewers to go and look up because it's a great book to
Mark Gabriel.
understand. Mark Gabriel, and the book is Jesus and Muhammad, and I've read so many books about Islam and the West, and this one really really stands out for its clarity, at going to the root of exposing what this ideology really is like from someone who is unquestionably, they say Al Azhar, as you said, as their arm, their weapon to discredit you. He was the real deal professor at Al Azhar. So
There you go.
there
Now,
you go.
you're someone, obviously, given your family background, but you're also someone who, wasn't in the faith. You're Westerner, you're Westernized. So you can straddle both communities. What do you think is the explanation? I mean, I have my own thoughts on this, but maybe you've got a different perspective. What explains the fact that the West is so reticent to accept these blatant realities regarding the ideology? Now, again, we shouldn't have to say this, but criticizing a religion or an ideology says nothing about hating individuals. I have more Muslim friends than most people will ever meet. It was Muslims who were going to kill us in Lebanon, but it was also Muslims who freed us, who allowed us to escape. So there is good and bad in any particular
No,
group.
there's a distinction between the ideology and
Of
the
course,
people who practice it and the degrees at which they practice it.
of course. So, but
That's evident.
in your view, what is it that causes? Is it that they associate? I'm talking about the Westerners. Is it that they wrongly conflate criticism of the religion with hatred towards people, and therefore you shouldn't do it? Is that the obstacle that causes people to not speak openly about realities that are so clearly, visible?
Gad, it's been almost 20 years since 9/11, and when you look at what's happened since, and you look at these politicians, whether it was George Bush or even more blatantly Obama, and the press and the press, every time there is an attack, they say this sentence that I cannot stand.
This is not Islam. Islam is peace.
Islam, you took the words out of my mouth. Islam is a religion of peace.
Yes.
I cannot stand
Yes.
this lie, this sentence, and it's such a blatant lie. And this is what has been going, on for 20 years. We keep hearing this sentence, this sentence, this sentence. Now, where it's becoming more and more difficult to justify saying such a thing because the terrorists themselves keep on justifying their actions in the name of Islam. So now it's moved to, Islamophobia. This is what's been going on for the last few years. Islamophobia this, Islamophobia that. When we know that Islamophobia was a term invented by the Muslim Brotherhood some 30 years ago,
right,
as a form of, defense mechanism not to allow anybody to criticize this ideology. I keep saying ideology because it's incomplete to call Islam a religion, because it's comprised of a set of religious beliefs, a military doctrine, and a political agenda.
Of course.
So
this is why,
that's why,
if I can interrupt you, Noor,
yes.
This is why and you can go and read my stuff on this. I think the distinction between Islam and Islamism is complete nonsense. Islamism is Islam. Islamism is simply the political component of Islam. Islam has an element that is spiritual, but it's actually a very small element of the bigger picture. So there is no Islam or Islamism. Islamism is Islam.
No, the only thing you have is a distinction between a literal classical application of Islam at one end of the spectrum, and if you look at the whole other end of the spectrum, it's a loose cultural,
Right.
application.
Right.
And then you have Muslims who are on that spectrum, right?
Yeah.
And to give you an anecdote, I was in a restaurant once having dinner with a young woman who was actually from Lebanon as well, and we started talking about Islam, and she said, no, but Islam is a religion of peace, and she was trying to defend the ideology. And then I told her, well, do you know that this and this and this, namely that, they have to kill Jews and Christians, everything is written in the Quran? And she turned to me and said, no, actually, I've never read the Quran.
Of course.
But she considered herself, culturally, I can respect, but she considered herself culturally Muslim. But this is, the bridge, the gap that we have in terms of that spectrum. From, this young lady who was, we were in a bar and a restaurant and having drinks and everything, so who's culturally Muslim. And then on the whole other end of the spectrum, we have these, Muslims who apply Islam in this very literal sense as per Muhammad's instructions from 1400 years ago.
So how is the reality? I remember many years ago there was I'm going to ask about Switzerland since that's where you're originally from. I don't know where you are now. You don't have to tell me if you're concerned about security issues. Although I don't have the same luxuries. If people wanted to find me, I'm easy to find because I'm a professor. So if you want to talk about security concerns, live in my shoes. But in any case, in Switzerland at one point there was a big story with the minaret, right?
Yes.
This was about maybe is it right to say about 10 years ago? Is that right?
Maybe just under. I want to say between. Around 7-ish years ago.
So how do the Swiss, if you compare their response to the integration of Islam within their societies, how do they compare on the continuum from sort of hardline non-acceptance, some of the Eastern European countries, to the Islamic Republic of France, which is at the other extreme? Where would we put Switzerland on that continuum?
Switzerland would lay someplace in between those two places, I would say. I think it makes me very, very sad to say this, but Western Europe, the situation is really dire. I know we're not supposed to talk about demographics because it's racist,
Yes, of course.
but it's a reality. The numbers, that we're looking at in 30, 40, 50 years time, I don't care if people are brown, red, yellow, that doesn't matter. It's the ideology that comes with it. And the more the numbers, grow, the more blatant. No, that I'm looking for the right word. Bear with me, because my mother tongue is French, and I always have to
To
sometimes think
translate.
to translate in my
You
mind.
know what? Let's do 1 minute in French, because oftentimes people say to me, "Oh, we never hear you in French. So why don't you speak in French and then I'll translate it." Go ahead. 1 minute.
Oh, all right. Ce que je veux dire, c'est que ici en Europe occidentale, le problème, ce sont les chiffres et la démographie et ce qui va s'annoncer dans les 30, 40, 50 prochaines années. Et plus les chiffres augmentent, plus cette population augmente dans nos pays, le plus le nombre de personnes qui ont adopté cette idéologie vont croître également. Et qui dit une croissance du nombre de personnes qui ont cette idéologie, le nombre d'actes commis au nom de cette idéologie. Et la preuve est ce qui s'est passé en France ces 2, 3 dernières semaines. Malheureusement, ça ne va que continuer dans cette direction-là.
Je vais traduire rapidement. So what Noor basically said is, if I were to summarize it in one sentence, demography is destiny. If you have an increase of a particular type of people who share an ideology, and you extrapolate in 20, 30, 40 years, there's going to be an increase of people who hold that ideology, and that's not going to be too helpful. Go ahead.
Yes, and thus an increase in people who are willing to commit terror attacks in the name of that ideology. Which is why, I'm sorry we're jumping around, but this is one of the many, many reasons why I support President Trump. But, everybody called him a racist and a bigot when he instituted this travel ban. It wasn't a Muslim travel ban, which is what the left loves to call it.
Of course.
But it was a travel ban on 9 countries who are known to have people who are willing to commit killings in the name of that ideology. And President Trump was absolutely right. Until we get a handle of how to deal with this, he was absolutely right to say we shut it down. We cannot afford to lose more lives. And you have the exact example of what it means to open the borders so mindlessly here in Europe. I tell you, I get so angry when I think of Angela Merkel and what she did in 2015. It really makes me really mad. And, these people didn't have to die yesterday.
Right.
You have this going on all over in Europe, in the UK, in France, in Germany, in Austria, in Sweden.
But I mean, isn't it
Belgium.
their fault? Isn't the fault of the victims for having attacked the innocent knife? It's really the Westerners who were attacking the Islamic knife of peace that caused this, right? I mean, that's what CNN taught me. That's what noble Barack Obama taught me. So why are you blaming the attack on the noble Muslim guy when it's really their bodies that attacked his knife? No, I'm confused.
Gad, I love your sense of humor, which is why I'm laughing. But it's I don't know. I'm going from anger when I think of this to then you make me laugh about something that is so sad to then sadness when I think about these people who.
But by the way, I
passed
use the humor and the satire. I mean, other than
away.
I'm naturally, if I may say, funny.
But I love dry humor.
I use the satire because it really is the only way to demonstrate the lunacy, right? That's
Yes.
why satirists throughout history are the greatest threats to the dictators and the fascists, right? And I have a section in the book about the power of satire, because satire cuts through warm butter like the surgeon's scalpel, right? It gets through all the nonsense right to the truth. And so when I satirize in the way that I just did a minute ago, I'm demonstrating how insane the positions are.
Yes. And, we've sadly, let this happen here in Europe. Bless the countries of Eastern Europe like Poland and Hungary who understand, what is at stake here. and who are, protecting their citizens. And bless President Trump for doing the same thing for America. And, I followed very closely what's been going on in America. We can come back now to something a bit more personal, but
Sure.
as part, of my really strange life and, childhood and everything that's happened, but my mom is very, pro-American. And I grew up with that. And so she definitely passed on my love for America. And she took me to the US, 2 to 3 times a year on holidays from the age of 3 onwards. So America was like my second home. And then obviously, because of my deep appreciation of my freedom and, just the concept of freedom from at a very young age, understanding how different my life would have been had I been raised in a society like Saudi Arabia, this really further ingrained and cemented my love for America in particular. And so I've, always considered America like my second home, and I've always followed, American politics, and especially the last few years, I was just so dismayed and worried, to be frank, when Obama was in the White House, to see everything that he was doing. And I alluded to that, in my segment on Tucker like 2 weeks ago. But when you see everything that, Obama did while he was in the White House, and this is something I would love your viewers to go look up when they listen to this. There is this man who sadly apparently was killed, earlier this year. I think in February. His name was Philip Haney. He was killed in California on the side of the road. I think it's still under investigation, but it's important that your viewers go and Google him. He was put in charge of a department within the Department of Homeland Security. It was instituted under Bush, and he was tasked with monitoring all the terror cells in America and all, the links, Muslim Brotherhood and all the financial things, and in order to monitor, terrorist activity in America. And one of the first things Obama did when he came into office was to shut that department down.
Right.
And this man was incredibly brave, and he went on the record. He went on Fox and he did interviews, and he wrote a book. The title eludes me right now, but everybody can find it. Philip Haney, Haney. And he explains, what happens. And he said, on record in the media, San Bernardino could have been avoided, if I had been allowed to continue my work and all of that. And
but that one, by the way, excuse me for interrupting you, Noor. The San Bernardino terror attack was actually blamed, and I'm not joking now. I'm not being satirical. I'm being literal. Was blamed on beard bullying. Did you know that?
What is beard? Oh, because of
the beard. So when he would go to work, his co-workers were bullying him about how his beard looked. And so he committed this act because of beard bullying. It had absolutely nothing to do with Islam.
Oh, yes, because when people, bullied me because I'm so skinny, that made me want to go and hurt people. This is a very logical way of thinking.
You mean you don't go when you're beard bullied, you don't go to Raqqa and throw gays off the rooftops because you were beard bullied? You don't do that? Because that's... No, you don't. Okay. So how have people in your milieu, if you could, I don't know if you're still connected to anybody within the Bin Laden family, has anybody reached out to you and said, hey, what are you doing? Why are you talking? Why don't you remain private? Or you're not really in touch with them?
No, so I think, and this is another element, but so people can really understand, but we were really cut off from the whole family and our father, to the point that even after 9/11, we were the only, my mom, my sisters, and me, we were the only Bin Ladens with a listed phone number in the book in Europe. So all the death threats and hate calls and everything came to our house. And our father was walking around, in Switzerland with bodyguards, and we were, the four of us without, the means or anything or security. And not even our father, called to see if we were okay. So it's just, it's a very complicated family situation, and we've paid a very high emotional price for our freedom, just not emotional, psychological, because, the battle that our father waged against us, in the courts spanning over 30 years, was very psychologically and financially very draining. And, we renounced, my mother did first, and I'm so thankful that she did. And I decided to uphold, her decision, but I renounced to any financial ties to that family, because nothing to me is more important than my freedom and my ability to say what I believe in and to live my life however I decide to live it.
You are this week's honey badger. In chapter 8 of my book, I talk about activate your inner honey badger, because I use the honey badger as the model of ferocity, right? A honey badger is the size of a small dog, and yet it could withstand an attack from 6 adult lions. How can it do that? Because it's ferocious. So congratulations, Noor, you're this week's honey badger.
I'm honored. Thank you very much. But no, just, I think it's fun. My life is full of, ironies in many ways, but everybody, or in the press, or when people talk about the Bin Laden family, they say that, Osama was this black sheep. And, it's actually my mom, my sisters, and
You're
I
the black
who
sheep.
are the black sheep of, the family. But, it's just the way it was. And another question I get asked so often is why I didn't, change my name. This is very
True.
recurring. There are, there's a top 5 of questions.
But you changed the spelling.
So that's, well, it's great, because then I can clear up everything, with this question. The way I spell it is the original translation from the Arabic name Bin Laden. And this is how my grandfather used to write it when he would translate it. And actually the official name of the construction group in Saudi Arabia is also spelled that way. So it's just a question of how the media and certain members of the family, I think, translated it in English. So actually my way of writing it is the original way. It's the way on my passport. And the reason why, even though it's been interesting or challenging to carry this name, the reason why, I didn't change it. And again, this is because 9/11 I was 14 years old when it happened. So my mom took certain decisions for me when I was not of age to make them. But looking back as an adult, I'm very glad she made them. And then I decided to uphold them. But, we didn't want to lie or hide who we are. This is, the name I was born with. And although it's completely antithetical to my whole being, what is associated to that name is so different to who I am. I didn't want to lie about it. And I've always had in mind, the victims and the families of the victims of 9/11 every single day on my mind and in my heart. And out of respect for them, they are allowed to know who they're speaking, with whom they're speaking. Right. They're allowed, we owe, I feel, and my mom, we feel we owe them that respect, that they know who they're speaking with. And if, yes, it means that, I have to explain a situation, regularly, but this is nothing in comparison. This is the way, at least, that I've, navigated carrying this very loaded name for the past 19 years, is that it's nothing in comparison to what people have had to live with following, that attack on 9/11. And that puts things in perspective. Certainly for me, it has for the past 19 years. But that's the reason why we we didn't want to change our name. People are allowed to know the truth.
Do you feel any, this is a bit more of a deeply psychological question. Do you feel any guilt by proxy, if only because of your connection? I mean, obviously you've got nothing to do with it, and obviously, as you said, your values are antithetical. But is there that sense? So, for example, the fact that you are so honest with your name, is that driven in any way by a guilt by proxy that, you know, I belong to this group, I come from that group, I may repudiate everything that they stand for, but do you feel any of that, or not at all?
So for sure, it's not guilt that I feel, and I don't feel at all that I come from that group.
Okay.
So that's not it at all. But as I wrote, in my statement for 9/11 that I, posted on my Twitter this year, there is a link that's there. My life is forever linked to that day and to these victims and to these families. And there isn't a day that goes by, where if either it's from my own accord, or I see my name on a piece of paper or my passport, or I read an article, or it's mentioned, whether it's a sitcom or a piece of news, there hasn't been a single day since 9/11 that this hasn't been in my life. And it always takes me back to the people who lost their lives that day, and to those who still suffer from that loss to this day, 19 years later. And especially since, I feel so close to America, on that day, I was in school. I just started, I think, the ninth grade, and my mom came to pick me up from school, and, we're 6 hours ahead here. And, we sat down in front of the television because the attacks had just been perpetrated.
Did you know that it was your uncle then before it was announced? Did you already have a sense that? Yeah, go ahead.
So what happened is that I was sobbing and devastated, and I couldn't believe what was happening. It felt like someone had attacked my home. When I was in Switzerland, but it felt like someone had attacked my home. And excuse me. And after a few minutes, I was with my two sisters and my mom, and we were watching television. And my mom, sat us down, like huddled us and said, girls, be prepared. Your life is never going to be the same again. Because she knew the moment the second plane hit that it was Osama bin Laden. And so it was maybe an hour or a couple of hours before the first time the name started circulating on the news. She told us,
but is that,
brace yourselves.
But is that because she can put together the pattern of the unfolding reality in the way anybody else could? Or is it that she had, I don't mean prior information that she knew he was going to do it on that day, but that she already had a sense based on anything she might have heard as inside information that this was happening?
No, she put it together, but not like anybody could have put it together, because she, and this is, my mother is considered as an expert on Saudi society and the mentality there, because my father at the time of their marriage really relied on her insight, and she's a very intelligent woman, if I may say so, and she was kind of his right arm in his business and his affairs. So not only as a woman, but as a foreigner, she has a unique vantage point from, that time in history after, the petrodollars boom and, Saudi Arabia rising from sand, from nothing, to a materialistically modern society. And she was privy, to meetings where only men were present, and she was the only woman because my father allowed it, and he was so powerful at the time. And so she got to analyze the society unlike anybody analyzed it. And my father would confide in her about, the different power plays between the rivalries between the princes and the brothers within the Bin Laden clan and everything that was going on behind the scenes. And also subsequently, you know, when they separated, I was born in 87 and they separated New Year's Day, 88. But for the first, you know, 4-5 years, they still spoke and he would still, you know, exchange information despite, you know, the whole separation going on. And, you know, she analyzed that mentality, that ideology, and she knew, you know, she knew that Osama bin Laden wasn't going to stop. And we had, you know, the 1993 bombings in the basement of the World Trade Center. Then, you know, you had the 1998 bombings in Tanzania and Kenya and the embassies. And so she knew it was going to continue. But she never imagined it would be something of the magnitude of 9/11. Nobody could have imagined something so atrocious, you know. And 2 days before, Commander Massoud was killed in Afghanistan. And we were in the living room and she shot up from her seat when we were watching the news, and she said something absolutely terrible is going to happen, because she understood that the Taliban had to take Massoud out because they were going to do something so big that America was going to be forced to invade Afghanistan, and they needed to weaken, you know, Massoud's faction because they were going to help the U.S. And so from that moment on, she knew in her stomach something awful was going to happen. And 2 days later, we had, you know, 9/11. So I grew up, you know, with all these, you know, stories from, you know, my mom's time in Saudi Arabia, analyzing the society. And, you know, as I grew older, I also wanted to understand, you know, why, you know, my life was as it was, why, you know, also from a psychological perspective, you know, my father, you know, rejected us, and, you know, how his behavior, you know, with many respects, you know, not saying hello to us in the street, and, you know, just some really weird stuff that was happening. And my mother, thankfully, I don't know how she did this, but she managed to tell me the truth, but without making me angry or resentful towards my father. And, you know, just understanding that this was a very different culture and a very different, you know, mindset, and I'm quite detached to now. You know, I've made peace with it, and I understand, and I was thankfully never angry about anything. But you still want to understand, you know, as a child, why, you know, you're going through certain things, you know, family-wise, even before 9/11. But so understanding this culture, understanding the mentality is something that, you know, I would obviously ask my mom questions about, and then want to go read, and then to go read about, and then, you know, it was out of my control, but then it became something that was bigger, much bigger than me, and public, much bigger than me, and very public. And
so what? Let me interject. What's next for me? I mean, you've come out now. You're much more public. You're making more appearances. You've stated your position about the U.S., about 9/11, about Trump. What is this sort of the start of you becoming, you know, a player in the public arena on many issues, or was it just a small foray into the public eye and now you retreat back into your private life?
You know, I didn't ask myself that question. I am writing a book. Writing is what comes naturally to me, much more than doing video interviews. But writing is what comes naturally to me. And but I decided to speak out publicly because there's just so much at stake next Tuesday.
Yeah.
And you actually wrote it as well, you know, in your introduction. We cannot just be passerbys in this fight or this battle of ideas and ideals. And I couldn't, with a good conscience, just sit down and say nothing. I knew that I would have an immediate platform solely because of this weird name
Right.
that I carry. I knew that. And I also know myself, and I know that if I hadn't spoken up for my beliefs in 10 years' time, or however down the road, I just wouldn't have been able to look at myself in the mirror. And it's just so important. I am 100%, behind this man. I admire him so much. Everything he's done since taking office, whether it's as, a patriot at heart, who loves America, seeing everything he's done for his own country really warms my heart. And then, on the foreign policy front, it's just been so stellar. Not least, how he's defended Israel and all this incredible progress that has been made in barely one term. I mean, of more than, many people, the significance of what has happened, with all these peace deals. And
So if you had to give, as we come to almost the end of the show, if you had to give a message to anyone who's listening between now and Tuesday, who is an American and is yet to cast their vote, take it away, Noor Bin Laden. Go for it.
No, I just want to tell them that, even for us outside of America, we're watching very closely. And, patriots, whether or not they have the nationality, we love America. We love what America stands for. We love what your founding fathers were able to achieve. It's absolutely unique in the history of the world, enshrining those rights and those liberties that are God-given, that no government should be allowed to infringe upon or take away. And this is exactly what's happening right now at this moment. They, the globalists, whatever you want to call them, as I wrote in my letter to America, they are trying to take away your freedom and your autonomy. And the only man, the man at this hour who can stop that from happening and who can preserve your republic is President Donald J. Trump. And we need 4 more years. Look at what he's achieved in the past 4 years. It's absolutely unprecedented. And I want to see what more he can do in the next 4 years.
As we say in Arabic, inshallah.
God willing.
God willing. There you go. Hey, Noor, it's been so nice. We're going to chat a bit offline. It's been so nice having you on the show. And
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. I think you had challenged me to a game of soccer. I think I might need to send you some clips to remind you who you challenged to a soccer match before you feel so confident about your abilities. But we'll continue this conversation. Go ahead.
I'll just say I was captain of my soccer team for 12 years.
Oh boy, then I'm really scared now.
And I won, certain championships here in Switzerland. So maybe, I don't know who I'm up against, but, we'll still be able to have some fun.
I look forward to it. Stay on the line. So nice to have you.
Thank you
I'm
for
hoping to
having
have
me.
it up later today, or if not, maybe tomorrow. Cheers. Let me just close the thing.